morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is I'm Senior Advisor on Monetary Policy to Governor Isărescu. So I'm speaking at this hour at this conference because Governor Isărescu was supposed to address the conference in person, could not attend the opening session of this conference, given a very busy schedule. Actually, he has a schedule conflict. Therefore, he asked me to represent him for a few minutes and address the conference. I will start by mentioning that he is deeply honored to extend his greetings I'm very careful to follow his words, to all the participants in conference hosted by the Faculty of International Businesses and Economics, part of the Bucharest University of Economic Studies, renowned Romanian higher education establishment. He also warmly thank you for the invitation to participate in the opening session of this scientific event. I think this is the second conference organized by the Faculty of International Business and Economics and hosted, at least partly, by the National Bank of Romania. The previous one was, if I'm not wrong, hosted last year in the same venue. It is Governor Isărescu's belief that over the past year, Europe witnessed a number of impressive and positive changes. However, further challenges are laying ahead, and they concern both the cooperation between macroeconomic policies and further institutional capacity building, especially with respect to a common fiscal policy of the Eurozone. Governor Isărescu asked me to make clear that he shares the views given by President Mario Draghi in his remarks at the farewell event in his honor in Frankfurt am Main on October 28th this year, namely that the past 20 years have taught us two vital lessons for a successful monetary union. One lesson is that the monetary union needs a modern central bank, and now I'm quoting from President Draghi, able to deploy all its instruments commensurate with the challenges it faces, and a truly federal institution that acts in the interest of the whole euro area. It's my personal remark here. The operating word from this quotation is federal. The second lesson is that, and I'm quoting again from President Draghi, now is the time for more Europe, not less. I'm making this emphasis because the main topic of this conference is the future of Europe. This means more Europe, means a continuation of the institutional construction of the European Union. This also means building a fiscal capacity in the euro area that could concomitantly stabilize the monetary union and contain moral hazard. President Draghi emphasized in his farewell speech that such a fiscal capacity could not be obtained without the building of an appropriate capital markets union. Such a capital markets union is needed to share risk in the private sector. Then it remains less risks to be managed by a central fiscal capacity. In the end, the central fiscal capacity could be used to reduce risks for the entire union when individual fiscal policies would be unable to play their role. This is why I said before that the operating word is federal. And from federal, we can derive federalization in our minds, not in his words, but we can imply. Building a strong fiscal capacity at the level of the monetary union might mean to share individual sovereignty, but as President Draghi said, and I'm quoting again, sharing sovereignty is a way to regain sovereignty. His view is endorsed, and this is what Governor Isărescu asked me to make very clear to you, by Chancellor Merkel and also President Macron. The Chancellor has spoken about taking our, and I'm quoting, destiny into our own hands if we want to survive as a community. Her arguments goes to the international context with many powerful players, and if we want to survive as a community, we should remain a power player. President Macron coined the term European sovereignty, for which, as the European Central Bank outgoing President Draghi said, a political infrastructure has to be built. And here, I think the operating words are political infrastructure has to be built. This means that, at least in my view, it's a tremendous challenge, because a monetary union, as history has proved, could not survive without a political union. We know several monetary unions, and over time they failed just because this political infrastructure was missing at that time in the past. Achieving these high objectives is not an easy task. It needs a lot of knowledge to identify the best ways to complete them. Your conference, as many other conferences which are focusing on the topic of the future of Europe, can contribute a lot to this end. I am sure that many valuable researches are going to be presented and discussed today and tomorrow, the 2 days of this conference. Governor Isărescu asked me to mention that the National Bank of Romania has always encouraged and supported the public appearance of young Romanian researchers by organizing conferences and seminars. And please let me give you one example of several. At present, the Central Bank frequently invites Romanian and foreign researchers to deliver presentations at the Bucharest Economic Analysis and Research Seminar, which is called BEARS. This seminar was set by the Central Bank, and since its setting, I think almost 2 years ago, it has continued to work perfectly. The event was launched in September, to be more precise, 2017, and counted thus far more than 18 guest speakers from foreign universities and research institutions. Let me say the magic phrase: I wish you all every success with this year's conference. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, Mr. Ambassadors, dear colleagues, dear students, it's a great privilege for me this morning to address you the welcome speech of this conference on the behalf of our Executive Board, on the behalf of our Rector, Professor Istudor. We have the 10th conference in Future of Europe, but also the 8th conference in Synergies in Communications. Both of them are conferences organized in our faculty, Faculty of International Business and Economics, and both of them are conferences which are organized within the university framework of all-year conference and debates. It's a great opportunity these 2 days to debate and to assess the main issues facing Europe today, taking into account all the turbulences and challenges we face nowadays in the global business environment. And we hope that you'll profit at maximum of this event in order to, first of all, to disseminate your results in research, but also to have very good networking opportunities during 2 days. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, to the Faculty of International Business and Economics, but I would like to thank to the National Bank of Romania and to Governor Isărescu for hosting us in this beautiful palace. And I would also like to thank to our sponsors who are with us during these days and who are providing some help for us. Thank you very much and have a fruitful conference.
Good morning. My name is Gheorghe Hurduzeu, Dean of Faculty International Business and Economics. Este o foarte onorantă întâlnire de astăzi și dați-mi voie să spun câteva cuvinte în limba română. La cea de-a 10-a ediție a conferinței The Future of Europe și a 8-a ediție a conferinței Synergies in Communication. Este o ediție specială care cred că ne dă argumentele ca să transformăm aceste conferințe într-un brand, așa cum un brand este și va rămâne Facultatea de Relații Economice Internaționale. În numele facultății, dați-mi voie să vă mulțumesc pentru participare, în primul rând de invitațiilor din străinătate, apoi tuturor celor care s-au înscris în a prezenta și disemina rezultate ale cercetării într-un domeniu deosebit de provocator, și anume acela al Europei, al viitorului Europei, într-un context foarte dinamic. De asemenea, vreau să mulțumesc și organizatorilor și Băncii Naționale, domnului guvernator Mugur Isărescu, și tuturor celor care au contribuit, mai mult sau mai puțin, la organizarea acestui eveniment. Nu în ultimul rând, studenților, care sunt printre principalii, să spunem așa, beneficiari și, pentru noi ca profesori, sunt cei mai importanți, cele mai importante active pe care facultatea le are. Dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students, for me, it's a great honor to be here, to declare the conference proceedings open and wish you a big success. Let's this edition to be a reference. Thank you very much.
Hello and good morning, everybody. A warm welcome also from me to all those who've come from further away and those who've made it through the streets of Bucharest on this rainy morning. We are very pleased that we are also this year here at the National Bank of Romania, and because they haven't been mentioned yet, I would like to express on behalf of all of us our thanks to the main organizers of this conference, Professor Cristian Păun, for the conference The Future of Europe, and my colleague, Associate Professor Marina Militaru, for the conference Synergies in Communication. And it is an excellent example of cooperation among the two departments of the Faculty of International Business and Economics. So, welcome to all of you to the plenaries of this first morning, and it is an honor to invite our plenary speakers, and for the opening plenary, Professor Mihai Corca, who is Emeritus Professor of the Bucharest University of Economic Studies and active professor of the University of Bucharest. He was also former Vice Rector of the Bucharest University of Economic Studies and former Dean of the Faculty of International Business and Economics. And it is a great pleasure to have him today for the opening plenary of this event, Adapting International Business Education to a Changing World. Professor Corca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, dear students. I am privileged to have the honor to speak in this first plenary panel of the 10th International Conference on the Future of Europe. Let me tell you that back in 2006, as I was Dean of the faculty, an extremely enthusiastic group of young fellows of mine were coming to me and suggesting that we could organize an international conference on the future of Europe. Of course, I immediately took over that initiative, and I offered them full support for organizing the first conference. It was a small one, but it was the beginning for something that now comes to its 10th edition. So I would like to thank to the young ones of that time and to the young ones of today that we are still organizing that conference, and I'm very pleased to see how the conference grew and got relevance not only for our university, but also for the national and international community of researchers interested in the various facets of the Europeanization and globalization of international business. Today, I would like to speak about how we should adapt our international business education to the changing world. We all know that we do have subject benchmark statements. We do have higher education qualifications frameworks in almost all European countries. We do have also similar other professional documents which offer an orientation and give suggestions to the education providers what should be taught and how should we attain the expected learning outcomes. So why should we discuss adapting international business education to the changing world? And I would like to give you some elements which are triggering simply our vision about the content and the way we are teaching our present and future students. Afterwards, I would like to introduce what should we adapt, and finally, how should we adapt our conduct in this extremely dynamic and complex international environment. So, why the whole discussion about adapting international business education? First of all, because the content of education should comply with the evolving expectations of the stakeholders. And these expectations are not something rigid, something given once for all the time. The expectations have changed, so the content of the study programs had to change over time and changed over time and will continue to change in the future. It is my pleasure to let you know that back in 1913, the Bucharest Academy of Higher Commercial and Industrial Studies, the initial name of our universities, started to operate with an undergraduate program showing a strong interest for international business. It corresponded to the knowledge and understanding of international transactions of that time. On the other hand, it expressed the interest of the Romanian kingdom to become a regional hub for international business and to increase exchange in goods with the Middle East countries. Over the decades, that regional interest changed, and so changed the curriculum for business and especially for international business. But this is history, and coming back to our days, let me underpin the fact that the world of today is highly dynamic. It reveals many facets which are rooted in the last 20 to 30 years evolutions in knowledge, technology, communication, social and cultural and political developments. Among these developments, we cannot neglect or ignore at least the following aspects. And the list is unfortunately pretty long. First of all, we should not ignore the fact that we are living globalization. The world is becoming more and more narrow, and we are living in the global village with all its positive and negative effects, and modern information and communication makes this world even smaller. And remote destinations are easier reachable from a day to another. So globalization is one change factor. And we should have this factor well treated in order to develop the global mindset, not only for students in international business, but also for all the students, if possible for all the nation. And the Department of International Business should have an active role in doing so. Then comes regionalization. It plays a specific role in fostering international business and in making it more profitable. But that regionalization, and I'm thinking about European Union now, it cannot limit the interest of countries and of private businesses to look to other business opportunities which are beyond the borders of the European Union. Another aspect which is obvious is the fact that the services sector acts as a powerful growth engine in all the countries. And I will quote from the World Trade Annual Report, which was recently released in Geneva, practically 3 weeks ago, released at the public forum of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. From that report, let me tell you a single sentence. Services generate more than 2/3 of economic output in the world. Their services attract over 2/3 of foreign direct investment. Services provide almost 2/3 of the jobs in developing countries and 4/5 of the jobs in developed ones, in developed countries. In other words, services have a strong and complex impact not only on national economies, but also services increase and diversify international business. We should bring more emphasis in discussing about trade in services. Another aspect which cannot be ignored is digitalization. It exerts a complex influence on our private and professional life. It transfers significantly most of the professions. It has and will continue to have a strong impact on what we trade and how we trade, on what we are producing, what we are trading, what we are consuming. But the readiness to accept and make use of the newest digital and artificial intelligence tools in the day-to-day life or in our professions is differentiated among generations. Millennials and Generation Z are comfortable with the technological advancement, while older people are not, and many hesitate to benefit of it. Otherwise, let me tell you in other words that this generates a societal disruption among generations in terms of communication, understanding, and handling problems. Millennials and Generation Z request that international trade negotiation as well as cross-border business rules take into consideration vital issues for humankind as climate change, water and air pollution, deforestation and desertification, migration, poverty alleviation, and global health. How to integrate these issues in the negotiations and in the rules is still under question mark. But the recent WTO public forum held in Geneva in the beginning of October this year noticed and took over the responsibility to find means and ways to do so. We should also be active in trying to accommodate these concerns of the young generations in our curriculum and in our teaching disciplines. There is a stronger influence, a stronger mutual interest between international business decision-making in the international policy and the political diplomacy. The way in which public diplomacy frames the international business environment and the effectiveness and visibility of national and international institutions involved or engaged in setting that frame. This also has to be brought closer to our students, to our audience. There is a growing role of civil society and of social media in the national and international dialogue that should be also respected and taken over in how we are teaching and what we are teaching to our students. I would not neglect the multicultural dimension. Multiculturalism is present not only in international organizations, not only in international business, it is present also in companies and corporations operating inside the country. As a growing fraction of the human resources in these companies and corporations is coming from other countries, with other cultures, with other beliefs, with other educational background. All these have to find an appropriate place in the education of the present and the future international business professionals. But there is also another aspect which refers to our audience. The increasing heterogeneity of the student body enrolled in undergraduate and in graduate international business education programs asks also for adjustment and flexibility instead of a rigid, one-fit-for-all provision of education in form of the traditional ex cathedra transfer of knowledge, which is mostly theoretical knowledge. We have to change it. And it is your decision how to make it more profitable for improving the learning environment of our students. So the second point refers to what to adapt. And here I do have three main crucial ideas. First of all, we should think about organization and management of the teaching and learning process. Secondly, we should think about the content of curricula and syllabi. And you will see why I'm speaking about curricula, more than one curriculum. And thirdly, we should rethink how we are educating the future professionals in international business. Speaking about organization and management of the teaching and learning process, let me remember you that the European higher education landscape has significantly changed in the last 2 decades, mainly due to the Bologna process. In this process, the European Union's formal competencies are limited, in particular through the subsidiarity principle, but there is another tool, the so-called open method of coordination, which helped the European higher education area to modernize and to get more efficiency and transparency than ever. So we cannot neglect, we cannot ignore the progress made by, under the umbrella of the Bologna process. Let me remember you just 4 of these instruments which are bringing and making more efficient the management of higher education institutions and the management of educational programs, among them the educational program in international business. The European credit and transfer system. Then let me remember you the fact that since a few years we do have a Romanian qualifications framework which is perfectly compatible with the European qualifications framework. We discuss about it, sometimes formally, sometimes substantially, about the concept of learning outcomes, which is not rezultatele învățării. It is a much broader sense of this term in English, and we should be aware of it. And last but not least, we do have a series of arrangements for the interinstitutional, national and international mobility of our students, which is also due to the fact that during the Bologna follow-up meetings, members, the 48 members which are now signatories of the initial Bologna declarations, have found the way of accommodating national regulations with this, let's say, European orientation documents. But besides improving efficiency in education management, unfortunately, these standardization measures have also generated an extreme specialization of tasks inside each and every higher education institution, inside the organization of study programs. That deep specialization triggers changes in the organization and management of teaching and learning process so that students fully benefit of the best learning environment. The specialization of tasks requires higher education managers to put in place complex technical assistance to the teaching staff in order to prepare and use the best digital video and audio tools applicable in the transfer of knowledge and skills, which is unfortunately missing in the current practice of our universities, and we should move towards making it a real practice in our university. It means a change in the way students and teachers are interacting during the direct contact hours and outside the classrooms. It means permanent availability of teachers via internet and intranet 24 hours, 7 days per week, in order to share knowledge and experience, in order to offer advice and orientation to those in quest for solving an individual or a group learning or research question. Speaking about curriculum, I would not insist too much on what we do have in our curriculum at the Faculty of International Business and Education. But in the context of standardization of the managerial instruments, the teaching staff should also go beyond the review of the curriculum and bring under scrutiny the content of the educational segments, the content of syllabi, the content of the internships, the content of the teaching resources, and the way they are made available for the students and for the larger public. And that means to have more and more effective dialogue among the members of the teaching staff which are promoters of change, and those who prove to be resistant. They have to be convinced that we have to advance in our quest for better higher education. Speaking about the need for educating new professionals, let me tell you that in the industrial economy, international business professionals used to have and still have in the current practice such an important role that we barely can imagine other ways of tackling the problems than those imagined and put at work by the professionals. But professions are not immutable. As we are progressing into the knowledge-based internet society, traditional professions cannot offer the best solutions. And the new technologies and digitalizations are, on one hand, dismantling traditional professions, but on the other hand, they create a range of new opportunities, new ways of sharing experience and knowledge. This speedy and profound transformation of professional works in international business has to have its correspondent in the education of the future professions in our faculty and in all the study programs referring to international business. How to adapt? This is the last point. First of all, addressing not present-day educational needs, but addressing lifelong educational needs of persons taken as the whole persons. We cannot ignore the fact that the market is more and more accessed by non-academic providers of education in international business, and that they are extremely active and very, very flexible. We think we have also the provision of massive open online courses, which are more or less not recognized in traditional higher education institutions, but which are visited and which are increasing the professionalism of our students, if we are wishing it or not. So, as a result of the technological changes and of the fast digitalization process, there is a greater need that universities and other organizations bridge the gap between employers' needs and the human talent potential. We cannot remain at the level of sporadic education, as a young doctoral student from Barcelona was stating. We cannot stay with knowledge acquired once in our lifetime. We have to head towards lifelong learning. And that means to integrate traditional teaching and traditional study programs into a larger set of programs which are dedicated to audience of different level of education and of different categories of knowledge. That now comes a pretty difficult to me topic related to how to endorse the post-Bologna endorsement, as I used to be for many years one of the official representatives of Romania in the Bologna follow-up group. The progress registered during the 20 years of Bologna process is undeniable. But after 20 years of shaping the higher education landscape in Europe, experts and scholars observe that the technical instruments have more easily been implemented than the more broadly defined initial 6 goals of the Bologna Declaration. And these broad academic goals are challenged by the fact that most of the administrations, and unfortunately a good part of the teaching staff, is ignoring these fundamental values of academic life. We are speaking about academic freedom, we are speaking about institutional autonomy, we are speaking about higher education as public good. So because these are still not well taken into account, many scholars are recommending to come back to the basics of the Bologna Declaration and to bring the process closer to the mission accomplished qualifications. Now, we cannot offer that qualification for the Bologna process. On the other side, voices in the public arena, as well as employers, express their concern related to the level of qualification obtained by a bachelor diploma holder at the age of 21, 22, 23, and his or her commitment and readiness to assume responsibilities once employed. We need to rethink the Bologna cycles. We need to better differentiate bachelor degree programs from master's degree programs. More than that, the volatile occupational behavior of the recently graduating generations and the changing patterns of employment determine education and training providers to look to a new set of degrees. In Romania, for the moment being, it's only here and there that we are discussing about that, but it comes. its reality we cannot ignore. This will challenge in the next future the attitude of traditional academic international business education providers and will generate more market-driven supply of training and education in this field and in all the other fields. In order to make these changes, I recommend that we are scrutinizing collectively the need for content update. And here the program leaders have an active role to play in order to bring people together and to have collegial but deep reasoning regarding on what to change and how to change. We have to be careful, as I've mentioned before, on how we are transferring knowledge and skills, going until the technical tools of internet and of artificial intelligence, which have to be integrated in our teaching and learning process. A final point here would be how we are listening to the industry. You know, in the beginning of the 80s, the rate of unemployed young graduates reached 35–40% in the best developed European Western countries. And at that moment, rectors and ministers of higher education have started to think about how to better make use of the public role of universities in accommodating our graduates with the needs of the labor market. But there are positive experiences, but not only positive ones, and we have to look carefully to the kind of relationship between university and future employers of our graduates, which were misleading the way we are thinking about curriculum and syllabi in our programs. Listening to the industry might lead to jobs for graduates of today. But if firms fail, it might represent also unemployment for tomorrow. This is why it is not sufficient to concentrate on the opinion of employers. It is very important to combine these opinions with caution foresights of the changes in the labor market, in the creative technologies, and in other domains of sustainable development. Only if we are putting together all this information, we will be able to think about what we have to do today in order to give the best professionals of tomorrow. So, what to do? How to start the future practice? I have to resume what I have told until now by declaring that the context makes it difficult to take the best decision. But there are persons in charge, and we are just before elections in our university, which should take over a leading position in the contribution of promoting the changes. These future leaders of our university should be active, energetic, and dynamic leaders who clearly understand the need for comprehensive transformation in the educational supplies. The school leaders and the program leaders have to be open-minded, charismatic, and communicative. They should have the power to convince and to motivate colleagues in order to support and to make progress a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Korka. And now the invitation is to you, if you have questions to address to Professor Korka, if you could formulate them so that our plenary speaker makes a note of the questions, and then after all the plenaries we will have an open discussion with questions and answers. But if you have questions, comments for the first plenary, please formulate them. Professor Korka, please make a note of them, and then after all the plenaries we will have discussions. Please, Professor Miron.
One of the most qualified and valuable expert in education, Professor Korka, as Dean, Vice Rector, State Secretary for Higher Education in the Ministry, Minister Conseiller, expert of World Bank, and so on. My question is, in your viewpoint, which are the most pressing pitfalls of Bologna process, which here in Romania we did not overcome?
I saw also another hand raised. Thank you. Another question? Okay. Then we have to express our regret that Professor Serra could not come, so the second plenary speaker in the program is not with us due to a technical problem of the plane leaving from Barcelona, so he couldn't arrive. Therefore, our next plenary speaker is Mrs. Mickey Aronson, and it is a pleasure to introduce her. As former head of the Foreign Relations Directorate of the National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office, she is now an expert in international relations at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security in Israel. Having this joint interdisciplinary event, it was a pleasure for me to note that among her various degrees in diplomacy and international relations, she also has a degree in literature. So it is a pleasure to welcome you to this joint community of economists and language experts. So a very warm welcome. Her topic for today is international lessons from the Middle East. Mrs. Aronson.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to my very generous host sitting here in the front row. Thank you to this distinguished audience that gave me a very good excuse to come and visit Bucharest for the first time. I'll try and be short and blunt, and I would happily take questions afterwards. I stand here more as a practitioner than as an academic, because the Middle East is not a very good place for theories. Things happen so fast in the Middle East that most theories are tested and refuted before what you write reaches print. The Middle East seems to be an accelerated version of a very bad neighborhood. We have economic crisis, demonstrations, revolutions, wars, refugees, massacres, oil and gas, a lot of oil and gas, unfortunately less in Israel, international involvement, and so on. And all this in a very, very short period of time. Europe and the international community are very much involved in many of these events in different aspects, from the wish to install, from the wish to install liberal values to following US leadership in attempts to reach certain goals. What I would like to do is suggest 4 very brief, down-to-earth strategic observations for Israel, for the Middle East, and for Europe and the international community, and use them to address some other regional Middle Eastern issues that are highly relevant also for Europe. So, observation number 1. Involvement of external powers in the Middle East, including European countries and the European Union. International involvement, I mean mainly trying to promote values and install liberal values and democracy in the Middle East. Now, the argument boils down to two main perspectives. You have sovereignty, you have human rights issues. The bloc that is trying to promote, preserve, and guard sovereignty is mainly Iran, Russia, China, Turkey. On the other hand, you have human rights states that believe that in the name of human rights you can breach sovereignty. You have the US, you have the European Union, and other states. Evidence from recent years, definitely in the Middle East, proves that when Western states pursue this goal in the Middle East, while ignoring the complexities of tribal societies, of ancient societies, it ends in a choice. You have aggressive dictatorship or you have bloody chaos. Prominent examples are what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, what happened in Syria, and I can continue. And I think I will leave the choice open to the audience to choose what is not as bad. There is also a great irony in working for the very important value of human rights and liberalism, because sometimes actually you strengthen the opposite trends. An example from this decade. The United States refused to sign a defense deal with General al-Sisi from the largest Arab state in the Middle East, in the largest Arab state, Egypt, in 2013, because he took over the country's leadership in a military coup. Now, who was the US protecting? General al-Sisi, the guy who is fighting Al-Qaeda organization in the Sinai Peninsula, brought down not Mother Teresa's followers, but brought down the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, I think, is one of the organizations that is most opposed of liberal values. General al-Sisi did not have to wait long because Russia signed a $3.5 billion defense contract with Egypt. Now, if we discuss international involvement in regional conflicts, Europe has been very much involved in trying to assist and positively solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I would like to claim there is no ripeness to solve this conflict at the moment. The Zionist Israeli movement and the Palestinian movement seem to be still holding on to the struggle. They're not tired of the struggle, and they are still willing and ready to continue and fight each other. So trying to solve this conflict at the moment, even with the very, very good intentions of Europe, seems to be impossible. It may be wiser to try to manage it instead of solving it. Also, Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Western European attempts to solve it, please bear in mind, the conflict is highly important for the Palestinians. It is also solving, of course, the conflict is highly important for the Israelis. But as the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter proved, it is irrelevant to any other point of conflict in the Middle East. It is irrelevant to whatever happens in Syria. It is irrelevant to whatever happens in Libya, and it has certainly no impact on Iraq or Lebanon and so on. Beyond the Middle East, an example of the American move to open an American embassy in Jerusalem. The whole world was trembling. What is going to happen if the Americans actually decide to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Jerusalem is considered one of the most controversial issues in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. What happened? Almost nothing. We had demonstrations. There were demonstrations in Gaza. But you know what? The world went on, and the Arab states, there was no revolt. You had demonstrations somewhere, and it was proven that it is not a reality-changing factor, either in the Middle East or in Muslim countries beyond. So, a suggestion for Europe, coming from the Middle East, maybe Europe would like to pick its battles differently. States do make very cynical use of this conflict. Russia, for example, is left out of the international process of mediation in the conflict, and therefore it pursues a very dangerous narrative saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the source of all evil in the Middle East. And until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved, extremism will continue prevailing in the Middle East. Mr. Erdogan of Turkey is also trying to draw the attention of the Turkish people from the economic conditions in Turkey to the economic conditions of the Palestinians and the conflict. Which brings me to another relevant aspect of international and European involvement in the Middle East, which is refugees. This used to be a moral issue in essence, but today it is used and serves countries as a leverage. Russia is trying and force Europe into providing for the reconstruction of Syria as means of strengthening the regime of its ally, President of Syria, Assad. This is done by using the threat that unless Syria is reconstructed and it is possible to provide decent living for the refugees, refugees will go on and flood Europe. Turkey, for example, was promised a 6 billion euro aid package from Europe, so far received 2.35 billion euros. And more importantly, Turkey was promised that it will enjoy free traveling for owners of Turkish passports in Europe. It didn't happen, and Erdogan is turning a blind eye on refugees moving from Syria through Turkey to Europe. A second observation from the Middle East has to do with economic and military ways to exert pressure and fight terror. Now, terror in the Middle East originated by states and organizations. I can tell you in Israel there are daily attempts to perform terror acts. If somebody tells you it can be blocked 100%, he is living in an imaginary world. It cannot. In Israel, it is usually blocked, sometimes it isn't. If I refer to terror by states, I would like to refer to Iran, which exerts terror either directly or indirectly by proxies, like the militias it established in Iraq and in Lebanon. Now, Iran is under the burden of very hard sanctions, and a burden it is. The militias sponsored by Iran that are recognized by Europe to be a terror organization and terror entity are confronted with growing public pressure because Iran cannot finance them as it used to be, and they cannot provide the same level of livelihood as they used to for their supporters. You can see what is happening in Iraq, you can see what is happening in Lebanon with the demonstrations. Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, is also weaker because a lot of its funds went to fighting in the name of Assad for Syria, and people in Lebanon and people in Iran are tired of fighting somebody else's war. So sanctions are definitely crippling. And how do we know that? We see Iranian provocations in the last few months. What happened? Why all of a sudden? Because Iran is in such an economic condition, it cannot afford to wait for President Trump to go away and wait for a more favorable regime in the US. So we see bombings, we see provocations in Saudi, in Yemen, and attempts to exert terror around the world. Now, Iran is demanding the lifting of the sanctions as a condition to negotiate with the US. Please explain to me the logic. It doesn't make sense. The weaker party, Iran, pressures the stronger party, US, just to come to the table and negotiate, just to agree to negotiations. Now, there are many economic and business experts in this room. How does that work? What is the logic? One issue, maybe one aspect, which is positive about Iran's behavior is that it managed to bring together former rivals like Israel and Arab states, like Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain, even Egypt and Jordan are getting closer, thanks to a common enemy. When we're dealing with terror in the Middle East and the means to fight it, we cannot forget the Islamic State, IS, formerly known as ISIS, and its deceased Iraqi leader, jihadist Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, may he not rest in peace, and thank you, America, for that. The Islamic State, as declared by al-Baghdadi in 2014, no longer exists, thanks to using forceful military measures. It does not exist in the form of a state, but the ideology is still there. And Europe should consider not only the believers scattered around the Middle East, but also those European supporters of IS who were practiced and who were indoctrinated in Syria and now import these ideas back to Europe. I would like to conclude this part by a quote that is often referred to Russia's President Putin about ways of handling terrorists. To forgive the terrorists is up to God, but to send them to him is up to me. I shall move to my third observation from the Middle East that has to do with deterrence. Deterrence, which is the willingness or the lack of it to portray what is called in the professional jargon costly messages. That is, when one who is sending the messages is willing to pay a price to do so. It seems the West is reluctant to portray costly messages, but is far more willing to just talk about it. Western deterrence is seriously eroded in the Middle East. A typical example, and the reason, is the response of the Obama administration to the chemical attack in Syria, following the famous red lines President Obama set in Syria that he threatened to attack if there is another use by chemical weapon. We all know what happened. The US did not realize its threat, and states and people in the Middle East, also like the Kurds, wonder now what is the value of an American handshake. Take the case of Iran again, for example. The US hardly responded after a major US ally, Saudi Arabia, suffered an attack, ongoing attacks, but lately an attack on its second largest oil production installation a few weeks ago. The lack of costly message to Iran in this case is at least partially driven by the lack of willingness to pay a price for delivering the costly message. Yet, the perception that a forceful response means an all-out war against Iran is not necessarily true. An example for such a response are Israel's hundreds of attacks against Iranian targets in Syria to try and prevent an Iranian direct line from Iran going through Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Lebanon, and then reaching the Mediterranean Sea. Israel attacked Iranian targets in Syria without reaching a full-scale war. Israel failed to stop Iran from a military buildup in Syria, but it succeeded in very much disrupting it. When the US did not even attempt to punish Assad for the chemical attack, it paved the way for an increased Russian involvement in the Middle East. Russia is taking Israel very seriously, and it seems like an absurd. You have huge Russia with its 11 time zones, and you have Israel, which is very hard to find on the map. Why is that? Because Israel proved its capacity and its willingness to serve as a spoiler for Russian plans in Syria. Russia doesn't mind if Israel attacks Iranian targets. It does mind if it attacks Syria's Assad assets, and Israel is trying not to do so. My last and fourth observation is about US-Russia dominance and rivalry in the Middle East, and beyond. And everything I say about Russia's actions in the Middle East is very, very much relevant for Europe and this part of the world. Speaking of deterrence, Russia observes very carefully Western activity around the world and in the Middle East and calculates its moves accordingly. The Russians noted the lack of costly message from the US following the incident in the Kerch Straits in the Ukraine. What happened? Nothing happened. They also noted the lack of costly messages after Russian increased presence in the US backyard in Venezuela. Nothing happened. They also noted that the attack in Saudi Arabia went basically unanswered, and so did the shooting down of the American UAV by Iran. The Russians may have been the only ones that weren't taken by surprise when President Trump actually followed on his elections promise and declared he's pulling out of Syria. They listened very carefully to President Trump, who said, "America first, and war is bad for business." Trump actually, very unexpected from a politician, followed on his promise to bring the troops back home. I'm asked a lot, how come a nation with a defense expenditure, Russia, that is at least 7 times less than the one of the US, can replace the US as the dominant power in the Middle East? And I answer that the US simply does not want to be there, and Russia does. Russia perceives the competition with the US as a zero-sum game. And if the US is moving out, there is no vacuum. Russia will move in. The Russian calculation is risk-based, avoiding, would America deter? Would America respond to any Russian provocation? Probably it will not. And it is also interest-based, and I mentioned Russian interests in Syria. I would like to end with a particular relevant note for my European colleagues and friends. Russia is looking for a global deal. It is not looking for a deal in the Middle East. It is accumulating leverages in the Middle East to be used in a potential future deal elsewhere. And I believe that the desired Russian deal and priorities are not in the Middle East, but closer to this part of the world. Thank you. I would happily take questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Aronson. And now, over to you if you have questions.
Thank you. To the first point that you made about the situation in Egypt, I'm curious to ask, should we not maybe accept that if we have democracies and democracy in a country like Egypt, that they don't act like maybe we in Europe or you in Israel want? Maybe we should accept simply the situation that people in those countries go a very different path than we wish to, because the Muslim Brotherhood was elected democrat in a democratic way. And I think it's very difficult to say if we should accept to remove a government like this or not. Then a second point or question about the leverage that countries like Turkey have in order to put pressure on the European Union. I think this situation unfortunately will not change anytime soon, because the political situation in Europe is so divided, especially in countries like Germany, that there will not be any clear solution to this problem of the refugee crisis, because the leadership in Europe does not want to make a clear position on that. Yeah, those were my 2 questions or points.
Any other question? Okay then.
Sorry.
Yes?
Hi, sorry for that. I have a question about the Russian and Iran relationship. What do you think about that? Russia and Iran. And also, what do you think about the Turkey's intervention in Syria, about that exclusion area that we are talking these days? Thank you.
Okay. So if there's no other question, then I would like to introduce Professor Paul Dębiński, Professor of Strategy and International Competition at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, Director of the Geneva-based Foundation Observatoire de la Finance, and co-president of Ethics and Trust in Finance Prize, among a lot of other very rich activities. The topic of his plenary today is families, the unacknowledged center of any economy. Professor Dębiński, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure of being here. I'm afraid I left the voice somewhere in the airplane, so I hope it will catch up. But to some extent, it's not fully there. So I beg your pardon for this. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It was a pleasure to visit yesterday the Bucharest University of Economics and to have this opportunity to have some talks with professors and colleagues on many issues, including the question of ethics in finance, but also touching upon the question of economics of family. But I take, before starting my talk, I would just, because there are plenty of young people around, and Professor Kurka was speaking about education, I would just share a small anecdote that happened to me 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was visiting the Jesuit Center for Worldwide Learning. This network is providing distance learning to people like you, but unfortunately sitting in different camps, migration camps and things like this. And there was a set of small interviews, what people expect from this education, business education, international business, accounting and so on. And one young lady, I don't remember where she was saying, well, we are here, we want to be trained, not trained for a profession, not trained to respond to labor market demand directly, but to make the world better. And coming from this environment, coming from this situation, I thought it is a message that I have to bring to younger audiences what I try to do here. The world has to be better, and we students, you students, but we are eternal students. So we students need to not to forget about it. We have to be formed and prepared for profession, but also be ready to change the world. So as the introduction has been made, I used to be an economist, and sorry, I forgot a very warm thanks to my friend Cornel Brabut, who is who left? He's here, Vice President of the European Federation of Christian Family Association, and that's the connection between the topic I'm going to address and the gathering here. As I told you, I'm an economist by training, dealing a lot with finance, ethics in finance, and it happened that I got interested at some moment why families are not addressed by economists and what can be done in order to bring the family as economic unit into the economic debate. So what I'm going to share with you are 2 chapters and the conclusion. One, it is about work, and the other one is about family, and all of it is about market, social market economy. So first bit is about humanity at work. You know probably that 2019 is the year of the 100th anniversary of the International Labour Organization. You can imagine why this organization was set in Versailles. The Russian Revolution was 2 years old, and of course there was more than a possibility of the revolution spreading not only to Western Europe, but possibly also to the United States. So something has to be done about labor. That was the beginning of International Labour Organization. Today, I discovered, because I was a little bit involved in some works around the ILO, I'm living in Geneva, so it's Geneva-based organization, so things happen. And I asked myself, what do we know about where the humanity, not European population, not African population, not Romanian population, but humanity is working? Can we provide a broad picture? And some of the elements of this picture I will introduce now. So, okay. So I have to start because I said a statistical picture. I was working and some of my books are about statistics on globalization. And I think this is an interesting quote because counting is a heavy duty and there is a dilemma behind. And I think it applies to family, to work, to all, to many, many aspects of economic life which are not crystal clear, precise. And what says a journalist who wrote an excellent book on statistics, David Boyle, but Einstein and Keynes have said things which are very similar. What he says is, if we don't count something, it gets ignored, especially in the age of digitalization and quantification. And if we count it, it gets perverted. It gets perverted because by de facto we have to homogenize realities that are by definition heterogeneous. So building categories, opening boxes and putting stuff into the boxes it's a potential perversion. So keeping this in mind, and it's not the joke, keeping this in mind, let's try to go forward. So what ought to be counted if you want to look at humanity at work? So let's turn to an international instrument, one of the conventions of labor statisticians in 2013, where they were trying to define what is work. What writes this resolution? Work comprises any activity performed by persons of any sex and age to produce goods or to provide services, and this comes very important, for the use of others and for own use. Work is defined irrespective of its formal or informal character or the legality of the activity. So we have goods and services, we have use of others and own use, very important. Work which takes place in formal environment, labor contracts and so on, established enterprises, and work that is taking place in informal environment. I will come back to it in 2 minutes. But do we exhaust with this the definition of work? If we turn to Christian thinking and we pick up a document which is important in Catholic Church, which is the Compendium of the Social Doctrine, and I think that Orthodoxy shares to a large extent with Catholicism this perspective on work, which says work represents a fundamental dimension of human existence. We are not in producing goods, we are in existence, as participation not only to the creation, but also the act of redemption. So we have these two definitions, one saying very economic and down to earth, and the other one which opens another dimension to work. Just to keep in mind that if we count something, we fundamentally have to pervert something because we cannot satisfy all the criteria. So what is counted in existing labor statistics? And you may know that ILO, International Labour Organization, is publishing the labor statistics, but is using the statistics that are produced by national labor offices, and this Conference of International Statisticians is trying to provide principles and guidelines to these local or national statistical offices in order to provide at the world level something of more or less coherent. So what is really counted, and it's not exactly what is in the first definition, and you will see why. There are two reasons for this. But first, there is a very deep influence of the labor market perspective. Labor market students, I think here and we all know that it's about supply and demand, and it's about remuneration. So labor market perspective leaves de facto aside some of the activities which are the activities for own use, which are the activities more difficult to identify, especially within the domestic economy. I will come to it in a minute. So work, from the economist perspective, work is recognized when there is remuneration. It can be a wage, or can be, in the entrepreneur world, it is a profit, but it's a remuneration. Work, by economists, most of the economists see and teach work as the opposite of leisure. So either you are in a leisure situation or you work. There is nothing in the middle. So your 24 hours are sleep, okay, live it, it's biological and physiological needs, and leisure or work, and work with remuneration. So you think that there's probably something missing in this equation. And when we go for work seen as remuneration, related to remuneration as non-leisure, well, in labor perspective, labor economic perspective, labor is very close to a commodity. When, in the other definition, we have seen that it has to do about dignity, about existence, about creation, about possibly redemption. So, commodification of work is a trend that is inspired and is to some extent present also in statistics. So reality of human activity, as we all know from daily experience, is probably less negative. It's not only something which is boring and non-leisure. It is not only this quest of remuneration. We have a lot of activities and a lot of work we do is done in the relationship settings, in domestic economy, and has gift as a right maybe name. So, you probably know that the term work, travail en français, is coming from this torture that was used by the Romans. And when we speak about work, there is, especially in some languages more than the others, there is this idea of suffering, of the suffering. So possibly, and I hope so, we can broaden the picture and not only keep the suffering side of work, but also some more positive dimension into work. Now, if we look at the statistics, these are ILO published statistics. You have a number of countries, and especially group of countries, according to the level of income. So you have Japan and Uganda as extremes situation, and you have in the middle of the graph different groups of countries. This is the age structure. And there is a dividing line. The dividing line is visible on the graph. On one side you have what is called the labor force. On the other side you have those that are out of the labor force. And the criteria is age. So the bulk of what is labor force is people between 25 and 64, and depending on regions, some bits and pieces of the population that is either older than 64 or younger than 24. So, but you see the more or less 55, 56, 57% of the population, and it's valid for most of the categories, 55, 56% are labor force, the rest is outside of the labor force. Sticking to the statistics, and I will try to correct them, if I may, in a few minutes. So now let's turn to work context. Now we had the demographic picture of labor population. It counted in units, in heads. That's very important. It's counted not in time, but in units, in heads. So coming back to the statistical documents, which set the objective. No, they're not describing what is in statistics, unfortunately, but they set the objective towards what the statistics should direct their efforts. So the same resolution lists various contexts, what they call economic units, in which work may take place. And you have 3 of them. And we are getting closer to the question of family. Market units, well, the standard corporation, quasi-corporation, household, family enterprises, and so on. We have the non-market units, well, we all know that's government, NGOs, and associations, and things like this. And we have households. Households that produce goods and services for its own use. So, if we push this definition to some limits, if I walk my dog, it's a work performed within household economy. Important. Nothing about this in the statistics, you will see. So, technical problem. The implementation of these definitions that I mentioned of the resolution 2013 collides with another well-established principle that uses the person, the head count, as the statistical unit of analysis. What does it mean? It means that if I'm a professor, my head is counted in the non-market units. And that's it. If I walk my dog, it disappears from the statistics because I'm counted within those that are work in non-market units. So this principle means that a given person's activity is statistically attributed only to one type of economic unit. Exactly what I said. So therefore, my walking the dog does not appear in the household, disappears from the perspective. So if we look at this key of looking at employment and labor activity in different countries, you see a different picture. You have four blocks of countries with different colors. You have the blue for family workers, which are acknowledged to some extent. You have employees, you have employers. So you have 4 categories, and here you start to see the differences which are due to regional institutional economic settings. We have a very high level of formal employment in northern countries, and we have a very low share of it in low-income countries and between the intermediary situation. And of course, I forgot to mention the own account workers. You see what is in green on the screen, not exactly in green on mine. In green, which are the self-employed. People that have an activity, they are not entrepreneurs, they are not employees, they are somewhere in between. And the share of this population is growing, statistically speaking, with the level of income. So that's another entry point into labor statistics. But there is a problem, to a large extent related to the self-employed workers, but not only, the problem of informality. A recent study conducted by ILO, with a slightly different methodology than the one I mentioned, is concluding that informality, so broadly understood, lack of contractual setting, either lack of employment contract or lack of insurance, lack of pension, lack of health insurance, etc., it's about 60%, it's an estimate, 60% of work that is carried out within these definitions is carried out in the world. 60%. Of course, it's much lower in Europe, it's much higher in Africa. But nevertheless, at the world level, it's 60%. So I just opened a small bracket The ILO, you can see the report that has been produced for the Centenary of Ilo. You can download it for the future, for a better work. They acknowledge that we have been thinking for decades that informality will disappear, and now we see not only it does not disappearing in developing countries, but is reappearing through Uberization of different kind of activities, is appearing where it was almost disappeared, especially in industrial, so-called industrial north. So it's an important problem if you want to know where humanity is working, to identify or to be aware of the fact that informality is just a small problem. It's not informality. It's not something that is, we can define as well, residual category. No, it's the majority, it's the middle. We have to confront it as such. So, coming back to what is our topic. So, we can divide the view on where humanity is working, I think, in two categories and two subcategories. One is the labor market activities with the formal side and the informal side. And in the formal side, you have a lot of things. In informality, as I said, it's more difficult to distinguish. And, which is not in the statistics, is the activity within the domestic economy. Because when I'm walking my dog, as professor, it does not exist. So what is the picture? That's about informality. I can drop it at different countries. We can come back to it in the discussion. I will not use your time. So the problem number 3 is exactly with this domestic sphere, because domestic sphere is not properly recorded, as most people share the time, as me walking my dog, between, I don't have the dog anymore, that's pity, but between more than one type of unit of activity. So the domestic sphere is often overridden by the labor market type of approach. I'm affected to labor market unit of activity, non-government, non-market one. So, I propose, and in the slide that follows, I used a different approach. I started from the fact, asking myself, well, take 24 hours of a normal day of humanity. One day, not looking at the annual statistics and so on, but just one day, 24 hours, taking away half of it for psychological needs, and we are left with about 12 hours. So where does it go? It's a very, very order of magnitude estimate. So we end up with this picture. The picture is the follows. You have the employment, the domestic economy at the bottom, the formal economy at the top, and in the middle, the informal one. Sorry, no, because there is a mixture of colors and kind of. So domestic economy is in the bottom, the formal economy is the middle, and the informal part of the economy is on the top in green. So you see on the global level, if we look at 24 hours, it's an estimate, but nevertheless we need an estimate. So almost half of energy and time is taking place within the domestic economy. About 20% are taking place in the formal world, and 30% more or less are taking part in the informal world. Of course, it's an average, and different countries has different proportions. But what is common is the base between 40 and 50% of socially available time is spent within households. Broadly understood, I'm not trying to define what is a household, what is not. Which is what is sure, and even statistical inquiries show it very clearly. Leisure is only a small component of it. As economists would say, either work or leisure. No, it's much more complicated. So what happens, and that's the second part of it, what happens within this household sector? And I think here we have to discuss why economists are reluctant to pick up the question of economics of family. So as you know, probably the etymology of economy is drawing on the oikos, the household, broadly understood in ancient Greece. It was not me and my dog, it was much more complex, and it provided a lot of, producing a lot of stuff for subsistence. So exchange was only a residual activity. But I think which is also very important is to understand that the economist approach, or try to understand the economic activities by putting in the middle of the scene the famous Homo economicus. Homo economicus, with this lonely individual which takes the decisions, maybe rational decisions, but takes the decision only in the perspective of its own needs. Satisfaction, utility, there are many approaches to it, we are not going to discuss it. But he is egoist, does not mean that he ignores the rest of the world. He is coldly rational, and the economic models consider it to a large extent as being the expression of the ultimate human nature. So it's not just a tool, but in many, especially in economics and management, the human being is portrayed often, hopefully not always, as being a quasi-homo economicus. But, as we all know, maybe not very young people, but the older ones that are in the room, that we seldom take decisions that are only individual. When we sign a work contract, of course, I sign it, but after having discussed with my family, possibly with my friends or with my brothers or sisters, if I'm younger, so it's not an individual decision. It's a decision that in most cases, takes into account a broader perspective, let's call it a common good of a group. It's the same for housing, it's the same for lodging, it's the same for schools, etc., etc., etc. So it's not the decision is formally individual, but is prepared, is set on different considerations. So it is important to be aware of that, because if we design policy measures on models that are based on the individualistic perspective, we forgot this common good, let's say, approach or element or dimension in any of economic decisions. So, okay, there is a complementarity between family and the economy. Because if we look at what's happening within households, it's a lot of economic activity. If we remember what is work, what's the creation of goods and services for own use or for market use, etc., independent on the context, informality or formality. So first of all, education. It's a fundamental. If there was no education, well, we could not have a good economy. We could not have good universities, because people would come to the university totally untrained and unprepared. Providers of care for young, for ill, for elderly, it's happening to an incredibly large scale, in some countries more, in some countries less. The families are regenerators of energies that make you start tomorrow to go to work, especially on Monday. And it's acknowledged by most of sociological research. Producers, and at the end, producers of goods and services, which are more trivial, but a lot, I'm just making a small footnote. If we look at growth patterns of our economies, I'm speaking about Western economies, post-communist economies, it was a little bit different during these years, but nevertheless, it applies too. If we used to have a meal at home, and from one day to the other we go to the restaurant, of course, there is, in terms of GDP statistics, something has happened here. There was a creation of wealth, would say. But was it really a creation of wealth? It moved from one activity, which is unobserved part of the economy, to an observed part, and we say, wow, it's new. It's not so new. People were not hungry. We're just eating in another setting. Which is better, which is worse, I'm not going to qualify. But we cannot say that nothing happened there. Of course, it's not the same for TV sets. When I buy a new TV set, I was not able to produce it at home. That's for sure. So, but all these efforts, what the family contributes to the economy, is somewhere hidden, is unobserved, is considered as being there forever, and the kind of windfall situation which is absolutely fundamental for the economic activity, but is there to last for a long time. And we should not, until recently, care too much about it. And here we can do a parallel with ecology. Until rather recently, maybe not just 2019, but 15, 20 years ago, the world started to consider environment as being something that has to be cared for. Until then, well, it was just there. And we could use it and misuse it, but it was there. So there was no reason to take care. Now we see the limits of it, climate change and so on, we start to say, well, we should preserve, we should maintain, because it's vital. And I think there is a parallel to be drawn, what's happening in the domestic economy, as I called it, which is not seen, but is fundamental. But the two are complementary, the market activity and, let's say, domestic activity are complementary, but there's also tension. And some people are more attracted to be on one side than on the other, for different reasons, monetization of life, etc., etc. So if the hypothesis, if the production of the household sector, of the domestic economy, shrinks significantly in terms of human education, in terms of care, in terms of pensions, in terms of regenerations, of course, service sector, the market could respond to it. But who could pay for it? It's something that will be unsustainable. Already today, we have in terms of GDP about between 25 and 30% of GDP that is used or that is used for health, social insurance, etc., etc. 30%. Could we go to 60, to 70, to 80? I'm not sure. There will be no TV sets anymore. So this unsustainable movement, this unsustainable burden, cannot be said just market will play it or state will play it. We have to look at the underlying economic activity. Economic activity. It's not social subsistence. It's economic activity. So, and the last point is this quote from François Pérou, who was a Christian economist, very important macroeconomist in France in the 40s, before even in the 30s. And he wrote a small booklet just after the war about capitalism. And he said, he has these 3 sentences that I suggest that we read and try to apply it both to social fabric, domestic economy fabric, think about in terms of ecology, and probably also in terms of moral fabric. A way of thinking that is prior and island to capitalism sustains for a variable period of time that framework in which capitalist economy operates. The framework in which capitalist economy operates. So capitalist economy has taken, if you want, roots in a setting, institutional, mental, etc. setting. But owing to the capitalist later very expansion and success, inasmuch as he received the esteem and gratitude of masses and fosters among them a taste of material comfort and well-being, he was writing it in early mid-40s. Well-being, it undermines the traditional institutions and the mental structures on which the very social order depends. Because it was carried from the past, it is used, and now it's challenged by the comfort and well-being. Capitalism erodes and corrupts, not in the sense of normal way of corruption, but corrupts in the sense of destroys. It consumes vast quantities of vital energy whose rise it does not control. Rise it does not control, it's coming from somewhere else. And then, turning to political leaders need a rare good-headedness in their diagnosis and an exceptional energy in administering the treatment if they are to detect and ward off this alignment before it is too late. So he was writing more than 50 years ago. I think this diagnosis is coming stronger and stronger and more urgent every day. To finish, I would like to share with you this graph, which has to do with Europe. As you know, the competitive social market economy is a model that is in the treaties, that is especially developed in the Lisbon Treaty, where the competitive qualification has been added. Social market economy is, let's say, an old story dating from immediately post-war Germany. So there is a social dimension, there is a market dimension, and there is a tension between the two. That was always the case in the soziale Marktwirtschaft. How much market, what kind of market, what regulation for the market, and what social. But under this social, we have to be very clear there are two elements. One is the redistribution, the public budget, expenses, subsidies, taxes, and so on. But on the other side, if you read the fathers of soziale Marktwirtschaft, they're very aware of the social fabric, what I called here the domestic economy. It was there. So the tension, how much market, how much social, it's not only how much public spending or how much taxes as opposed to how much free market. No, there is this third hidden element, which is not explicit, is seldom made explicit, and I try to make it explicit here. So yes, here we have the efficiency fight, we have the solidarity, welfare, etc. Dimensions, the state dimension. What Lisbon brought is the third one, which was not exactly in the loop in the soziale Marktwirtschaft that was seen as a closed economy. The question was not there. It was mentioned that globalization has not been around in the 40s. So, well, it was by nature something that was in a more closed economy than it is today. And here we have tension too. We have competitive, how to do it, how to achieve it, innovation, individualism, financial returns, incentives, monetization, etc., etc. But there is a tension. How much? How much with the world outside? How much internally? Well, and some instruments are coming back. And there is another set of tension, which is between the social and the competitive, which is communitarism, which is economic patriotism, which is global champions, national champions in globalization, and the quest for productivity and so on. So here for competitive, more and more, a world that would not dare to use 15 years ago, but today it's almost in the vocabulary, industrial policy, structure policy, even some cases exchange rate policy. We are in the Central Bank of Romania. They're not applying it, but nevertheless there are some international discussion who is playing exchange rates for which reason. Here we have this domestic economy and redistributive policies. So redistributive policies I mentioned, domestic economy, how to protect, how to make it blossom, how to make it really complementary to the market. And here we have all the competition stories, labor market flexibilization, etc., 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 but it's not the same as domestic economy concerns and so on. So we are in tensions, and the recognition of the importance of the domestic economy is part of, even if it's implicit in the social, it's part of this equilibrating game that is going on within larger structures as Europe, smaller ones than nations, also to some extent at the global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dębiński. Questions for Professor Dębiński, please.
Here, sorry. Yeah. Take this, please. Thank you. I would like to share a point. In the developing capitalist economies in South Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, we have something called the domestic helps. So I don't know whether you address this issue or not, but probably they are also involved with the family economy. So perhaps you might consider it as at some point if you haven't done it already. So that's the point I had to make. Thank you.
Nowadays in literature is in fashion to speak about impossibility trilemmas. In corporate organization, impossibility trilemma between sovereignty and globalization and democracy. Can we find this kind of impossibility trilemma in your scheme?
Any other question? Okay then. So, last but not least, it is an honor to introduce for the closing keynote presentation of this morning of plenaries, Professor Alina Bârgăoanu, who is Dean of the Faculty of Communication and Public Relations at the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration, Romania, and who for a while was also active rector of this university. So it is a pleasure and an honor to have you here. The floor is yours. With the presentation, EU Disinformation, the State of Play.
Thank you very much. Professor Dębinski, I can only hope that today's conference counts as work, not in the sense of torturing the audience, especially before lunch, but in the sense of becoming better persons, expanding our horizons and producing common goods. Definitely the previous presentations fit this description, and I hope that, again, I won't torture the audience with this last presentation. So first of all, let me express my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me and for putting this topic on the table. Let me express my specific thanks to two dear friends of mine, I dare to say to Professor Mariana Nicolae and to Professor Cristian Păun for inviting me here. Let me open my presentation with a very broad remark about communication. So I'm a communication scholar. I was part of the high-level expert group on fake news and digital disinformation. And currently I am an affiliate member of the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki. And my broad remark about communication is that this field is a latecomer in the field of government studies. It has been a sort of Cinderella of government studies. It was considered that out of government studies we talk of political science, international relations, diplomacy, law. And communication is something that comes after the decisions are made. In my assessment, we witness the revenge of communication in today's political life, whether this political life takes place at a local, regional, supranational, global level. And in my understanding, every major political event, social event, economic event, has a communication or a technology-related angle. Whether we talk about, if we take only very recent examples, the demonstrations in Chile, in Hong Kong, the Brexit vote, the withdrawal of troops in Syria, for example, all these events show a fierce battle over interpretations, over narratives, and over the technological means to spread these interpretations and these narratives. with this very broad remark about communication, which is of course a little bit pro domo, let me present my speech today about EU versus disinformation, the state of play. I have chosen to present the initiatives that the European Union has taken in order to fight disinformation, and also to present some initiatives that the member states as such have taken in order to fight the same phenomenon. As I have told you, I am very close to some of these measures. First of all, about the measures taken by the European Commission. The European Commission started to worry about this phenomenon, about disinformation, long before President Trump said that you are fake news in relation to mass media. So back in 2015, the East Stratcom Task Force was established with a view to addressing Russia's ongoing disinformation campaigns. Thank you. The budget for this East Stratcom has increased constantly over time. In 2018, there was 1.1 million euros allocated for this East Stratcom Task Force, with an increase to 3 million in 2019. I expect that the budget will increase in the future. In 2016, there was published the Joint Framework on Countering Hybrid Threats, and the very specific outcome of this joint framework was the creation of the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, which is jointly managed by member states. So the 28 member states are stakeholders in this endeavor, and this is conceived as an international hub for practitioners and experts. And then in 2018, we had the joint communication on increasing resilience and bolstering capabilities to address hybrid threats. At the end of 2018, you can see that there is a crescendo of measures. The European Council published action plan on disinformation, and its main highlights was to invest in digital tools, in data analysis skills. Another direction was to set up the rapid alert system, especially in the context of elections, to mobilize the private sector, meaning the digital companies, to tackle disinformation, to energize the civil society in order to identify and to expose disinformation, and to support independent media and fact-checkers. In September 2018, as a result of the high-level expert group on fake news and digital disinformation, a code of practice on disinformation was agreed by representatives of online platforms, social networks, advertiser, and advertising industry based on a voluntary basis. This code of practice, as the name indicates, we are talking about voluntary measures. There was no sector inquiry, there was no proposed legislation in order to fight disinformation, but the agreement at the level of the high-level expert group and at the level of the Commission was to come up with a code of practice. The good thing was that it was agreed by the main digital platforms, Google, Facebook, Mozilla, for example. And the highlights of this code of practice was to look at advertising policies of the platforms with a specific interest in political advertising, the integrity of the service, consumer empowerment, and empowering the research community. As you could see, the works of the high-level expert group who took place in 2018, it was very close to the European elections, very close to a new commission. There was some reluctance or reservation to come up with strong measures to present projects for the pipeline of the new commission, but there are some traces of this work, especially regarding these measures. As I have told you, especially Google, Facebook, and Twitter, which were part of the high-level expert group and digital disinformation, agreed to this code of practice and agreed to change their services in order to look at advertising revenues, in order to make political advertising more transparent, in order to address the issue of fake accounts and online bots, and they are supposed to report regularly on fake accounts and online bots. And also there was a wide agreement to allow academic researchers to look into what is behind Facebook, to look into APIs more specifically. Of course, there was a lot of discussion because the European elections were about to take place. So a main focus of all these measures had to do with securing the European elections that would take place in May 2019. And again, there were some specific measures. I think that all people in the room are familiar with these kind of measures. For example, there was the decision to sanction the illegal use of personal data, and you could see it in the Romanian context too, that the political parties were banned from using personal data in order to micro-target users, which was a completely different story compared to other electoral periods. So that was a very, very specific outcome of this code of practice. Another thing that was established in the European Union, and again I think that you are familiar with this because there was a lot of discussion in the Romanian public space about this, a rapid alert system was established in the context of the European elections that provided relevant instances of disinformation and the detection of cross-border activities. The rapid alert system, which was active in Romania too, enabled common situational awareness, coordination, attribution, and response. And it was supposed to target disinformation that threatened democratic processes. In the case of foreign influence operations, again, you could see that in Romania there was such a rapid alert system that acted under the authority of the Electoral Permanent Authority. Another measure that was implemented, so a very specific outcome of the European Commission, SOMA was created, which is the Social Observatory for Disinformation and Social Media Analysis, given the fact that there are researchers in the field, young people who are interested in the topic. This is a platform where various information about disinformation campaigns, data protection, and stuff like this are present, and they are based on open access. Another thing, and this is very important, I think, and this is not very well known in Romania, for example, in November 2018, revised Audiovisual Media Service Directive was approved. So Romania acts under this revised Audiovisual Media Services Directive. And it is important that this directive recognizes the importance of media literacy. It creates the obligation for member states to promote and to report on media literacy initiatives. Probably our conference could count as such an initiative to increase the media literacy initiatives. And very important, this is more substantial, introduces an obligation of video sharing platform services providers such as YouTube to take appropriate measures in order to protect the public from incitement to violence or hatred. So it is, from my perspective, this revised Audiovisual Media Services Directive is a huge step forward because, again, it introduces the legal obligation for member states to report and to promote media literacy initiatives, and also it introduces YouTuber as a broadcaster, and it makes it responsible for spreading hate speech and incitement to violence. The next steps, again, now there is a new commission. The commissioner, the president-elect of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that, probably you know the statement, said that hers is a geopolitical commission and that she will invest a lot of time and energy and that she will allocate responsibilities for every commissioner to involve in strategic communication, which is a very, very explicit statement. in favor of fighting disinformation on the one hand and promoting strategic communication. So we will see what will come out of the new commission, but again there are some measures that are already in place: the SOMA, the Social Media Observatory, the revised directive for the broadcasting sector, the code of practice to which the digital platforms agreed and they signed it. So I have talked until now about the measures taken by the European Commission. As you could see, these are pan-European measures. They are very relevant for each member state. Of course, you can debate it because this information takes place in national languages and it doesn't stop at the border. Something that is written in France, on social media, maybe this information about Romania, but we are not aware of it. So we can discuss endlessly about these pan-European measures, but I think that they are a good starting point. The European Parliament also was an actor in fighting disinformation, and again, it didn't start in 2016, but it started in 2014, and there were some resolutions that were voted in the European Parliament. Of course, these resolutions were drafted and approved on the situation of Ukraine and the state of play of EU-Russia relations. So there were such resolutions were signed in 2014, 15, 16, and also the latest one was in 2019. We will see how the new parliament will act upon these measures. In terms of fighting disinformation, as you could see, the European Commission is the major actor with some resolutions voted by the European Parliament, but still the European Union is made by member states. Member states are strong actors in the European Union, and I have made an outline of the member states' initiatives in order to fight online disinformation with various philosophies, paradigms. I didn't go through all member states, but I tried to highlight the peaks of such endeavors. Probably the most explicit legislation in order to fight disinformation, more specifically hate speech and right-wing extremism, comes from Germany. In 2017, Germany voted a law, which of course was highly controversial, and there was a lot of debate and a lot of criticism in the German public sphere and in the European public sphere about this kind of very, very strict regulation of disinformation, hate speech, and right-wing extremism. So this law, which has been active since 2017, covers online social networks with at least 2 million members, which in Germany are Facebook and Twitter. It does not address journalistic or editorial services, so it specifically targets the online social networks with at least 2 million members, and it addresses illegal content as already defined by the German penal code, criminal code. And again, probably this is the strictest piece of legislation in order to fight content which is spread on social networks. And online platforms face considerable fines if they do not remove obviously illegal hate speech and other postings within 24 hours of receiving a notification. I have just read in the morning that there is a new piece of legislation which is currently pushed by Angela Merkel, trying even to tighten this piece of legislation and establishing a legal obligation for the digital platforms themselves to notify dubious postings within 24 hours. In order to remove this obviously illegal hate speech, there is a huge center with about 1,000 employees that monitors the platforms. And again, in my assessment, this is the most severe piece of legislation for the content that is spread on digital platforms. Again, with a very specific scope, so does not address journalistic or editorial services, and it targets the illegal content which is defined by the German criminal code. But again, it is not with prior notification, it is not with a legal process, there is no judge involved, but if these people from this huge center decide that this is an obviously illegal hate speech, the platforms have the obligation to remove it within 24 hours, otherwise there will be fines. France has a law on the fight against the manipulation of disinformation, which was approved in December 2018. So again, there is legislation in order to fight disinformation. It is not media literacy, it is not code of practice, but it is also legislation about this. It is less strict than the German piece of legislation. It creates a transparency obligation for digital platforms, so the responsibility lies with the digital platforms, who must report any sponsored content by publishing the name of the author and the amount paid. So it plays the card of transparency. So the logic is that if there is transparency of political ads, this is a measure to fight disinformation. There is not an automatic obligation for digital platforms to take down the content compared to the German law, but an interim judge will qualify the fake news based on 3 criteria. The fake news must be manifest, must be disseminated deliberately on a massive scale, and this leads to a disturbance of the peace or compromise the outcome of an election. As a very, very funny instance, at some point an interim judge took down around 100 accounts on Twitter, and the funny thing is that these Twitter accounts were apologetic for President Macron. But this is the irony of life in general, because as a very personal interpretation, the law was decided in the context of the latest presidential elections in France with the idea to stop Marine Le Pen and somehow to favor the current president, but as I have shown you, the law at some point struck in Macron's court, so that was really funny for me. Of course, you have UK, where there is a whole debate going on. The debate hasn't stopped about the issue of election interference in the context of the Brexit vote. This is an endless topic. You can watch the HBO movie in order to get better ideas about this topic of disinformation in the context of the Brexit vote. What is interesting in probably Great Britain is one of the most advanced countries that started to come up with technology-related proofs that there is an interference. So their research does not rely on frames, narratives. I like this narrative, I do not like these narratives, but there were very, very powerful hearings in the UK Parliament, and people that were under the hearings were asked to come up with technology-related proofs about the presence of bots, chatbots, trolls, political funding of political ads and stuff like this. Apart from this very strong technology-related research, the UK came up with some regulations, which again play the card of transparency, both in terms of which services are regulated and the rules in order to regulate the digital platforms. An interesting piece, I found it useful for further reflection. The Ofcom, the UK regulator, specifies that it enforces regulation against bad behavior through proportionate and meaningful actions. So again, this is another example. I have chosen the example of Denmark because it puts an emphasis on a strong intergovernmental task force and something which probably in Romania would be completely labeled as the deep state. This intergovernmental task force has a strong presence on behalf of the secret services in Denmark. So this intergovernmental task force the Danish Security Intelligence Services and the Danish Defense Intelligence Services are present, so which is a completely different model from the French example or are from the German example. And again, this type of measures are meant in order to fight foreign election interference from hostile foreign actors. Of course, probably, not probably for sure, the elephant in the room is Russia, but in the legislation, they maintain the wording hostile foreign actors, based also on the fact that there is a multiplicity of actors that are active, so as opposed to the wording in the European Commission documents, which rely heavily on Russia. In the Danish case, they refer to foreign actors. What is interesting here, and again, when I looked at all these measures, of course, I couldn't help thinking about the Romanian context. Thing that I found funny or completely strange for a Romanian context. This piece of legislation says that the government will offer all political parties eligible to be elected to parliament counseling on the risk of foreign influence. Spain. Of course, I think this is again a personal interpretation. The Spanish state has been one of the most affected member states by digital disinformation with the secessionist movement in Catalonia. This is why they came up with some piece of legislation in March 2019, which is inspired by the European Union, and of course it has an input from the National Security Department, the Office of the State Secretary for Communication. You could see here that there is a State Secretary for Communication and several Spanish ministries. Again, Spain is one of the most advanced countries trying to come up with evidence, strong evidence about foreign interference, again, not relying on narratives, on topics, on voices, but on the issue of bots, trolls, fake accounts, algorithmic engagement, computational propaganda, and stuff like this. Very, very briefly, other examples. In Italy, there is an online portal where citizens can report police disinformation. And interesting, very interesting for me, it sets up a media literacy education program in 8,000 high schools, so this is huge. In Greece, there is an online register where online active media companies are asked to sign up, and of course to provide for some transparency. Belgium is a very nice case, which is very close to the Romanian case. Belgium stated that there is no need for specific legislation to counter fake news because this would affect freedom of expression and media freedom. And I'm sure if such a discussion opens up in Romania, we say we'd like to be like Belgium and not to do anything in order not to affect freedom of expression or media freedom. There is the Finnish case, which is very nice. They combine legislation, so very strong measures against disinformation, with very strong media and literacy programs. When I first read about the fact that they started to implement this media and literacy curriculum from kindergarten, of course I laughed. I said, oh, this is excessive. How can this be possible? But I had the honor to participate in a conference, and the Finnish expert explained that there is a strong technology-related literacy, and it really makes sense to have it since kindergarten. Probably if you have kids, you know that starting with 5 or 7, they are already on platforms, and they are not aware of the dangers, the privacy issues, and stuff like this. Also, I read about Finland, a very nice initiative. Their national broadcasting, so the corresponding of our national television, came up with a trolling game. So you can install the trolling game on your computer or on your mobile phone, and you are encouraged to act as a troll, to spread hate and to spread inflammatory content in order to increase your engagement, to get more likes, to get more shares. And the idea is behind is that impersonating a troll, you become aware of how easy this kind of spreading hate and inflammatory content can be done. And in this way, you become aware and you become more critical in your digital behavior. other examples which are not as strong, Lithuania, Estonia, they rely a lot on collaboration between journalists, civil society groups, and the military. So again, on the eastern flank, in the Baltic countries, there is that presence of the military and secret services in order to fight disinformation. And in Estonia, for example, they created their own Russian language public broadcasting channel as an alternative to the Kremlin-backed media. About Romania, and not about disinformation in Romania, because this will eat all afternoon. I mean, I can talk for hours about the situation in Romania, but about the topic disinformation and possible ways to fight disinformation and possible solutions, including in terms of legislation. My assessment is that in Romania we have a very polarized media, more precisely communication landscape. I think that the mainstream media on the one hand and the digital media and social networks are completely polarized. I think that based on a 5-minute conversation you can see whether a person watches a certain TV channel or whether he is a heavy Facebook user after 2 minutes or 5 minutes of conversation. I think that this polarization is real. It is not only the polarization of the media landscape, of the political leaders, but I think that we deal with a polarization of the society as a whole. I think that regulation of the digital environment in Romania is an impossible dream without the solidarity of the media and communication field, irrespective of the editorial policies or the political biases or choices. In terms of this kind of solidarity, probably if we open TV channels, it is impossible over one single day not to find harassment campaigns addressed against one journalist coming from the opposite TV channel. But in my understanding, I think that in order to regulate the digital environment, which is at the core, which is at the heart of the current disinformation disorder, this type of solidarity among media professionals is badly needed. And I think that in order to come up with a piece of legislation with regulatory measures in Romania in order to fight disinformation, some preconditions must be met. First of all, we have to come up with deep knowledge and understanding of the actions and measures taken at EU level and at the level of EU member states. I mean, I don't think it is enough to say there is German legislation and they force platforms to take down the content within 24 hours, let's do it like this. Or look at the Finnish case. But I think that what is needed is a really nuanced knowledge and understanding of the pieces of legislation, regulatory measures that were taken by EU as a whole and by member states. So this is one precondition. The second precondition, and I really care about this, I have a personal stake in this statement. I think that in order to find this information, we have to come up with strong technological evidence about the use, the presence of trolls, fake accounts, chat box, algorithmic engagement, the use of personal data for micro-targeting. I think that Romania lacks this kind of strong technological evidence about fake accounts, bots, fake influencers, fake algorithmic engagement. And I think that right now most of the public conversation focus on the content which is deemed as true or not true. In my understanding, this distinction leads to a cul-de-sac, and what is true, who decides what is the truth. But I think that in order to, and that was the position that I have taken at the high-level expert group and in general at the Helsinki group, is that we should focus on technological amplification and not on the content as such, because again, this creates huge difficulties, and you can label under the fake news term pretty much everything that you do not agree with. And we see this a lot in Romania, of course. Again, if I were to open the discussion about regulation in Romania, I would fight for evidence-based regulation. So again, coming with strong evidence that goes beyond speculation, gut feelings, oh, I feel the Russian presence because I do not agree with a certain point of view. So regulation should not come from speculation, gut feelings, inferences, or synergy of narratives. And my final point, which may be controversial, but I can further elaborate on this, I think that foreign interference, although real and a very important topic, should not be turned into an obsession because it creates a blind spot and it obscures discussion of the technological environment and the internal fault lines in societies. That was my presentation. This is my email address, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bârgăoanu. And now we open the floor for questions for Professor Bârgăoanu and then the discussion of the other questions already addressed.
Hello, I'm glad you mentioned the situation in Germany, because I am from Germany, and I can tell you that this NetzDG is, to be honest, a complete failure. What happened in reality is the responsibility was pushed to the private network operators like Facebook and Twitter, and they are responsible to take down the content. And it just led to the fact that they take down more content than they should, because they are scared of facing any punishments, and this leads to some kind of censorship, what we have right now. And it's even funny that the minister, Heiko Maas, who pushed this legislation, was affected himself. His tweets were deleted, and it kind of shows how smart this was. And at the same time, the focus is really just on this hate speech and the internet. At the same time, we had at Spiegel Online, a very famous and renowned online magazine, Klaas Relotius, a journalist that received numerous awards, that was spreading fake news, simply making up articles and interviews in one of the biggest online medias in Germany. And there, the politicians are completely blind. I think this is not a good situation. Thank you.
I can dare a question from myself. Okay, I saw the example of Belgium there, and I want to know about that situation, your opinion. So this fight against fake news is affecting the freedom of speech. What is your opinion on this idea? And secondly, I saw that there are few criteria regarding a news to be a fake or not. About hate speech, there are similar features classifying a speech to be a hating or not, about people, about situations, and so on. And because a joke can be a hate speech, but also can be a joke. Yeah? Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other question, then we open the floor to the panelists' answers to the questions already received. Professor Corca?
Thank you very much. Professor Dumitru asked me what is my opinion concerning the most pressing pitfalls in implementing the Bologna goals in the Romanian higher education. In my humble opinion, it's not about technical failures or postponements, which happened in almost all the European countries, starting with Netherlands, who had the first shock in observing the misconduct of some of the university management teams concerning the implementation of the Bologna process. The way they were reshaping the educational programs. The most pressing pitfalls are in how the Romanian institutional culture is answering to the basic expectations or goals of the Bologna process. The Bologna philosophy is, in most of the cases, used or approached only in a ceremonial way. Many higher education institutions in our country, unfortunately, show formal compliance to the European ideals, and what happens in reality is far away of the final targets of the Bologna process. And this is in our institutional culture, in our organizational behavior. Let me give you an example concerning institutional autonomy. We do have a strong legal framework for institutional autonomy as it is recognized in one of the articles of the Romanian Constitution. We do have strong, let's say, words or provisions in the education law. And yet, what is happening at university level? On one hand, rectors and deans and other responsibles for universities are always complaining the fact that the ministry and the subsequent central agencies are not respecting institutional autonomies and are giving all kind of second level regulation which do not respect institutional autonomy. But this is happening on one hand. And on the other hand, if we are looking to the same persons, they are always in the ministry and in the central agencies asking for support because they are not able to do what they should do in the name of the institutional autonomy. This is happening in Romania, and unfortunately, in all these 20 years, we didn't manage to correct that attitude. I think that we do need a totally new generation of university leaders and of school leaders in order to change this. And then only a short remark considering another, let's say, basic goal of the Bologna process. How should universities become more active in their capacity as public good? When we are looking to Romanian universities, many of them are focusing only on teaching. They are less focusing on research, even if they pretend to be research universities, advanced research universities, and so far. If you are looking to the managerial plans of the universities, these are empty words. They do not correspond to what the university is intending to do. I do not wish to be harsh, but somebody in each and every university should have a look to be more coherent in what we are saying or what we are pretending to be and what we are really doing. And on the other side, how many universities are really acting as a progress factor in their local communities? This is a huge question. We do have at European level the so-called smart regional development. How many Romanian universities have taken act of that smart development of their region and act as promoters as smart development? You may count it on the digits of one single hand. Thank you very much. This is my opinion.
Thank you. Mrs. Aronson, your question.
Thank you. Regarding the question of Egypt, and maybe we should let them be because this is what they chose democratically, this is actually what happened. They were left to be after the revolution of the Muslim Brothers. Nobody tried to interfere. Although bear in mind, living next to an entity that in its charter, you have an article that says your country should be demolished, and it would pursue actively actions to demolish it. An entity that treats the LGBT community, for example, by throwing them off a roof. So I think maybe the limits here to democracy is when it's trying to commit suicide and kill itself. Although I agree completely, liberalism and liberal values cannot be implanted. We as humanity learned how to implant the heart, but we cannot implant liberalism. Regarding the question of Turkey and refugees, unfortunately I have to agree with you. I think every country has its own interests, and unless Europe is able to have a single stance and to pursue it, it will continue to be divided and ineffective. Regarding the other question about, there were two. First of all, Turkish involvement in Syria. I believe Erdogan is trying to revive the old Ottoman Empire, to bring it back. There are, the Kurds are of great interest, a primary interest, but I think not of less interest are the oil fields in north of Syria, and I will take it even a bit further, even in Iraq. And if Turkey controls these oil fields, it could be energetically independent, which changes its position completely in the Middle East and the world. I think the only ones that can maybe limit those aspirations, and really I would not like to be a Kurd nowadays, are either the US or Russia. If not, they will proceed inside. The last issue was the Russia-Iran relations. I think they're not ideological, they're based on interests, and therefore they're opportunistic. If Iran destabilizes the Syrian regime of Assad, Russia would act against it. And since I truly believe they're looking for a deal, and they're interested in being in a position of being friends and talking to everybody. They're selling weapons to Iran, but they're selling weapons also to Bahrain, Iran's rival. So if I were an Iranian, I would be very concerned to fulfill Russian demands and not to trust the kindness of their heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Professor Dębiński.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There were two questions, one about our remarks, one about the domestic health policies or activity. I think that this is very important to bring it to the attention that Western world has to learn from a lot of practices that possibly existed here in past centuries and decades, but they're vital in many of the so-called developing countries. But this is a teaching book because we arrive at some stage where we are not able to provide through the two other channels, the market and the state, to provide all that human dignity requires. So we have to look for alternatives because the social fabric has been weakened, so it is not able to provide it anymore to the extent it used to. So it has to be brought to the policy debate. And the lessons and the learning from developing countries is absolutely vital. So thank you very much. Maybe we can speak about it in the coffee break because I'm interested to learn more about it. The impossibility dilemma. Thank you very much. But when there is an impossibility, there is no dilemma. So anymore. No, but the problem is tension. The problem is tension, and the problem is how to find the balance between the three layers. And of course, you can imagine some solutions that go only for market, that go only for social dimension, or only for international power in terms of economic power. The problem is to find the balance, and this requires a discussion about underlying values. Because on one side you have sovereignty, on the other side you have individualism, on the other side, on bottom side, you have a kind of harmonious society. But it has to be discussed in terms of values and instruments, not only in terms of instruments. So I don't think there is an impossibility, but there is a hard work to find the balance. And this balance will not be stable in time. It will be moving, and it has been moving, de facto.
Professor Dembinski, and now Professor Alina Bârgăoanu, please.
First of all, thank you very much for your comments because they reinforced what was present on the slides. But in order to come up with some piece of legislation in a different country, you really have to know the piece of legislation that was approved somewhere else and not to invoke it as a precedent that this is the best. As you could see, I tried to present these endeavors in a neutral way, not to take stances, but again, you really reinforce the view that for countries such as Romania to come up with measures, it has to study them very deeply, to talk to the locals, to see what the reactions are, what the counter-arguments are, so thank you for your comment. About the Der Spiegel journalist, I was in the United States when this happened in December last year. And I was somehow vindicated because in Romania, Der Spiegel is God's voice on earth, so sorry for being a little bit malicious. But still, I think that in this case, the journalist was exposed. We know him. He had to suffer some reputational harm, whereas in the case of trolls and bots, there is not even this kind of transparency. So my deep theoretical conceptual stance is that the cause of the current disinformation order is in the online environment, which doesn't mean that mainstream media are innocent or there are victims, but they truly are part of this information disorders, and sometimes they originated, they amplified. But again, if I am to make a comparison, at least in the case of the Der Spiegel, there is some reputational harm. There is that journalist, if he publishes something again, probably nobody, hopefully nobody will take it into account. Whereas in the digital environment, there is no such thing. There is no editorial content. We do not know the figures, no reputational harm. And this is very close to my answer to Cristi Păun's question about Belgium and the freedom of speech. Of course, this is the biggest concern when talking about the fight against disinformation, because there are strong words against any kind of measures, and these strong words are censorship, dictatorship, and stuff like this. For example, I read about some piece of legislation in Egypt, for example, where a person who has 500 followers or friends is considered as a media company, and they have to register as a media company and to provide transparency as a media company. I only have 3,500 friends, so I'm not under this legislation, not even in Egypt. But you are right, the border between censorship and trying to fight a huge problem is very, very thin. This is why, again, I reinforce the view that was presented during the speech and was on the slide. I have a strong focus on the technological factor in amplification. I tried, in every public conversation, I try to raise awareness that I do not talk about content so much, but about the technological means of amplification. Bots, computers, software, the use of personal data in order to come up with profiles and to allow for micro-targeting. And I recently attended a conference of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the head of the media department at OSCE said that, of course, freedom of speech is a sacred value of liberalism, but the question is whether this freedom of speech applies to bots, computers, and software. So again, this is my very strong stance, conceptual, theoretical, you name it, that we are not talking about content, but about the technological means of amplification. And the good part of the digital platforms is that there is no transparency for the user as such, but everything that is posted online in the end has some traces. I mean, it doesn't disappear. You can always do some reverse engineering and to come up with strong evidence about bots, trolls, and algorithmic engagement. So again, this is my very strong conceptual stance that of course we should pay attention to voices, of course we should pay attention to narratives, but I think that we are on the safe ground if we pay attention to the means of amplification. Because otherwise we step on this very slippery ground bordering censorship. So I understand the Belgium concern, but I don't think that this is a model for a country such as Romania, because it is one thing to be Belgium in the middle of Europe, where the capital of the European Union, and of course it is a totally different thing to be in Romania, the border of both NATO and the European Union. About hate speech, there are some official definitions of hate speech at the level of multinational organizations such as UN, some definitions that some regulators work with. But again, when talking about hate speech, of course, content is as such. But again, my strong stance is that we shouldn't pay attention to content, but about the means of amplification, because a piece of digital content can be very, very true, but if it is amplified 1 million times, it becomes fake. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank all our keynote speakers of this morning for their excellent plenaries. And before we move on to the next stage of our conference, I would like to announce the panels of the conference The Future of Europe, taking place here in this building, 2 of them. So at 2 o'clock, there's the conference panel, Financial Literacy, Challenges and Results, the Romanian Case. So 2 o'clock in this building, this very room. Then at 3:45, there's the conference panel, Rule of Law, also taking place here. The third panel of this conference, Future of Europe, takes place in the building of the Bucharest University of Economic Studies, and the panel is Europe and the Middle East, in quest of new international orders. That's at 5 o'clock. For all those who have registered for the gala dinner, it takes place at the restaurant of the Marshall Hotel in Calea Dorobanți, number 50B. And the panels of the conference, Synergies in Communication, are in the building of the Bucharest University of Economic Studies. The panels tomorrow, the plenaries, are in the Aula Magna of our university, Bucharest University of Economic Studies, and there are a few more panels taking place tomorrow. And you are all kindly invited now to lunch. And then make sure you arrive in time for the panels in the afternoon. Thank you all.